I've done maybe 300 site inspections by the time I pulled into the Mather Mill lot that Tuesday. Could have been more. After a certain number, they stop being distinct events and just become the job. You drive out, you walk through, you fill in the boxes, you drive back. Some sites are worse than others. Some smell bad. Some have ceilings that make you nervous. But they're all more or less the same shape of thing, and you get a feel for how long they take, and you stop thinking about them as anything other than hours on a timesheet. Mather Mill was supposed to be 4 hours. I had it blocked out in my calendar. Mather Mill, Sistersville, 4 hours. And then a hard stop, because I had a call with the property attorney at 2 o'clock. The sale was closing Friday. Not might close Friday. Not we're targeting Friday. Friday. The buyer's financing had a hard expiration on it, and the attorney had explained this to me twice already in a tone that suggested he was considering explaining it a third time. So, 4 hours, in and out. I got there at 7:45 a.m. The lot was gravel, which meant my boots were already picking up that fine gray dust before I even got to the front door. There's a specific kind of gravel they use on old industrial sites in this part of West Virginia. Not crushed limestone, something darker, almost black when it's wet. And it was wet that morning. Everything was wet. The sky was the color of old dishwater, and the air smelled like rain that hadn't finished happening yet. I noted that in a general way, the way you note weather when you're about to spend 4 hours in a building with a compromised roof. The county contact I was expecting was a man named Dennis Pewitt. I'd worked with Dennis twice before. He was fine, showed up on time, signed what needed signing, stayed out of the way. I was expecting his truck. Instead, there was a dark blue Honda Civic parked near the gate, and a woman standing next to it in a blazer that was not going to survive this building. I figured there'd been a scheduling mix-up. That happens. I parked and got out, and she came over with a folder and a set of keys on a county lanyard and introduced herself as Judith Sanchez, assessor's office. "Dennis is out sick," she said. "They reassigned the witness." "You've been out here before?" I asked. She looked at the building. "No," she said. She said it like she was aware that was probably the wrong answer. I looked at her shoes. Flats, the kind you wear to walk across a parking lot to a conference room. I almost told her to go back to town, that I'd reschedule. I thought about it for maybe 5 seconds, but the structural forms had a county witness line on them, and if I left without a signature, I'd have to come back, and I could not come back before Friday, and the attorney's voice was already in my head, doing its third explanation tone. "Okay," I said. "Stay close, watch your step. Don't touch anything that looks load-bearing." She nodded and wrote something in her folder. I don't know what. Maybe, "Don't touch things." She seemed like someone who took notes. The front door was a heavy steel fire door, the kind that takes both hands at a lean. Judith got the key in, and I pushed it open, and the smell hit us both at the same time. 11 years of closed air, mold, machine oil, and something underneath all of that I can only describe as wet stone. Old buildings smell like the thing they used to do. Textile mills smell like work. The entry corridor was dark. I had my flashlight out before the door finished swinging. The overhead fluorescents were long dead, and the windows on the lower level were either boarded or so caked with grime they might as well have been. The file photos I'd been sent were from the last inspection, which had been done in the spring of 2019. They showed a dirty but structurally unremarkable lower floor, concrete machinery footings, some water staining on the east wall. The file photos were not current. The floor was underwater. Not flooded, not like someone had left a hose running, but there was standing water across the entire lower level, maybe 2 to 3 inches deep, dark and completely still. My flashlight beam hit it and just stopped. You couldn't see the floor through it. It had the look of water that had been there a while, settled and undisturbed, not moving at all. I stood there for a second. "Is that supposed to be here?" Judith asked. "No." I swept the light along the walls. Somewhere there was a burst pipe. I found the source about 30 feet in, a section of overhead supply line that had failed at a joint, probably during a freeze. It had been draining into the lower level long enough for the water to go completely still and dark. I logged it. Burst supply line, lower level flooding, approx 2 to 3 inch depth, source identified, and kept going. The freight elevator at the far end of the corridor was dead. The gate was up, the car was somewhere above us, and the control panel was blank. I'd used the stairs. I was about halfway down the corridor, picking my way along the wall where the water was shallower, when I caught the boiler room door in my flashlight beam. It was a heavy door, industrial, the kind with a bar handle. It was wedged shut from the outside. Someone had threaded an iron pipe through the handle bracket and braced it against the doorframe. The pipe was old, surface rest on it. It had been there a while. I wrote, "Boiler room exterior pipe brace, contractor safety measure," in my notes, and moved on. It was the kind of thing contractors do when they decommission a space, seal off anything with residual pressure risk, anything they don't want a liability walking into. Made sense. I didn't think about it past that. We took the stairs up to the second floor, and the building changed. The upper level was dry. Well, dry-ish. Better light through the clerestory windows. The old weaving machinery was still in place, massive iron frames bolted to the floor in long rows. And I started in on the photography, working left to right, the way I always do. Judith stayed near the stairwell and wrote things in her folder. I could hear her pen. I was maybe 40 minutes in, halfway through the machinery bay, when she called out from the stairwell. "Hey, sorry, I borrowed your phone earlier to check the weather. The battery's dead." I stopped shooting. "Mine or yours?" "Mine. I got a bad charging cable." I pulled my phone out of my jacket pocket. 41%. There was a notification on the screen, a banner, yellow, the kind that pushes through even on silent. Flash flood warning, Tyler County. Little Kanawha River rising. Road flooding expected. Seek higher ground. I read it twice. Then I looked at the timestamp. It had come through 11 minutes ago. I walked to the nearest clerestory window and looked out. The sky to the south had gone a different color. Not just gray now, but greenish gray, the specific shade that means the rain is already happening somewhere close and moving this way. The access road below was still clear. Barely. 4 hours had just become something else. I told Judith to move. Didn't explain why, just set it fast and started toward the stairwell. And she followed, which I was grateful for, because I didn't have time to convince anyone of anything. I had the camera bag over one shoulder and my phone in my hand, and I was already doing math. 1 floor down, through the corridor, out the front, maybe 2 minutes, if the stairs were clear. I'd checked them on the way up, and they were fine. Wet in spots, some rust on the railing, nothing that would stop us. She kept up, I'll give her that. The lower corridor was darker than I remembered. The clerestory windows on that level were smaller, and half of them were painted over, and whatever light had been coming through before was gone now. I had my flashlight clipped to my jacket, and I clicked it on. The beam caught the floor about 15 feet ahead, and I stopped walking. The standing water from the burst pipe had been ankle deep when we came through the first time, maybe 4 inches. Dark, still, smelled like rust and old concrete. I'd logged it, stepped around the worst of it, moved on. It wasn't ankle deep anymore. It was at my knee, maybe higher. The whole corridor floor was gone under it, and it wasn't still. It was moving, slow but definite, coming in from somewhere at the far end, the boiler room direction. I swept the flashlight left and right. The baseboards were submerged. The bottom foot of the walls was wet and dark. The water had a color to it, that specific rust brown you get when old iron and sediment mix in. And it was moving the way rivers move when they're patient and don't need to hurry. "Oh," Judith said behind me. That was it. Just, oh. I kept the flashlight moving. The front exit was maybe 60 feet ahead, through the water. The door itself was elevated 2 steps above the corridor floor. I'd noticed that on the way in. Old flood mitigation, probably original to the building. So the door was still above the waterline. Probably. I couldn't see the steps from where I was standing, but I knew they were there. "Go," I said. "Go now." I went in. The water was cold. Not cold like a swimming pool. Cold like something that had been underground for a long time and wasn't interested in warming up. It came through my cargo pants immediately, soaked my boots, and I just kept moving, because stopping wasn't going to make it better. The footing was uneven. I could feel debris under my boots, soft things and hard things. Couldn't see any of it. I moved with my arms out a little for balance, and my flashlight forward, and I didn't look down. Judith was right behind me. I could hear her breathing. We made the steps. I went up first and pushed the front door, and it opened, which I'd been about 60% sure it would. And then I was outside, and the air hit me, and it was cold and wet and tasted like rain. The lot was flooded. Not a little, not some puddles at the low end. The whole lower section from the building face out to where I'd parked was underwater. Rust-colored, moving, maybe 8 inches deep at the near edge and deeper toward the lot barrier. I could see my car, a gray Chevy Colorado, parked about 40 feet out. It was still there, still upright, water at the door sills. Reachable, barely, but reachable. I looked at the access road up the hill. Judith's car was up there, a white Honda something, dry. The road itself was still passable, or looked like it from where I was standing. I figured if I could get to my truck, get it started, drive it up the access road before the lot got any worse, we could both get out. Judith could follow in her car. 40 feet of knee-deep water was bad, but it wasn't impossible. I'd done worse on site work. I stepped off the threshold and started moving. I got maybe 20 feet out. The surge came from the south end of the lot, from the direction of the river. And it wasn't gradual, it was a single pulse, like something had been holding back a volume of water and let it go all at once. The level jumped, not rose, jumped, and the current went from moving slowly to moving with intention. And I planted my feet and leaned into it and stayed upright, but just barely. My truck shifted. It moved sideways, slow and heavy, the way vehicles move when water gets under them and takes the weight off the tires. It went maybe 4 feet, and then the front passenger corner hit the lot barrier, a concrete curb running the perimeter, and it stopped there. Tilts it a few degrees, still running. I could see the exhaust, but the angle was wrong, and the current was pushing at the driver's side. And I understood that I was not getting in that truck. I stood there in the water for a second, just processing. Then I turned around and went back inside. Judith was still on the threshold steps, dry from the knees up, watching me come back. She didn't say anything. I got back inside and pushed the door shut and stood there dripping on the corridor floor and looked at the water level and thought about the 4 or 5 hours I'd originally planned to be here and how that number felt now. "My car is blocked," I said. She nodded. "I saw yours is still up on the road," I said. "I know," she paused. "We can't get to it." We couldn't, not through that surge. Maybe when it settled, but I didn't know when that would be, and I didn't want to be standing in a flooded lot when the next one came through. "We go back up," I said. "Upper floor. It's Fry." We took the stairs again, and the building changed for the second time. The dry air felt like a luxury now. The clerestory windows still let in light, though it was greenish and dim. We went to the machinery bay, and I sat down on one of the machinery footings, and Judith leaned against another. "Stanley Peterson," she said. "What?" "The dispatcher. His name is Stanley Peterson." She sat down on the machinery footing opposite me and took the folder off her lap. "He called me. He said they got reports of flooding along the Little Kanawha. He said road access is blocked." She put the folder on the floor next to her. "What else did he say?" I asked. She looked at me. "He said 4 to 6 hours." 4 to 6 hours. I said it back to myself in my head, doing the math on the battery life of my phone, the temperature in the unheated building, and the rising water line. 4 to 6 hours is a lifetime when you're standing on an island that's shrinking by the minute. I needed to confirm it. I spent the next 20 minutes walking the upper floor, holding my phone out like a divining rod, looking for a signal. The river stone walls were thick, original 1912 construction, probably 18 inches in some sections, and they killed the signal almost everywhere. Nothing in the break room, nothing in the records room. I tried the machinery bay and got 2 bars for about 4 seconds, and then nothing. The east window was the last one I tried. It faced the river directly, which felt counterintuitive, but I got 3 bars there, and they held. I didn't question it. I dialed 911. It connected on the second ring. The dispatcher had a slow voice, unhurried, like he had all the time in the world. I asked for Stanley Peterson, the guy Judith had spoken to. "This is Stanley," the steady voice replied. I gave him my information, name, location, situation. I could hear him typing. "Road access to the river district is blocked," he confirmed, matching what he told Judith. "We've got reports from Millstone Road and both county routes off the bridge. Nothing's getting through right now." "What's the timeline?" I asked. "Road's clear, we get a crew out?" 4 to 6 hours, minimum. Could be less depending on how fast the water drops. Stay on the upper level. Stay away from the water. Keep the phone charged if you can." He said it like he'd said it before, which he probably had. "Both of you stay put," he added. "We'll get there." I hung up and stood at the east window, looking down at the lot. The water was still rising. My truck was still tilted against the barrier, but the engine had stopped. The water was up to the door handles. The lot barrier itself was half submerged. The tree line beyond the access road was moving violently in the wind. I watched the water for a while, checking the level, mostly trying to figure out whether the upper floor was actually safe or just safer. The building had been here for over a century. It had flooded before, clearly, and the upper floor was still standing. I figured that meant something. I went back to the break room. Judith was sitting in one of the plastic chairs. She had her folder on the table and was going through her paperwork like she was waiting on a delayed flight. She'd found a vending machine somewhere on her own. There was a bag of Cool Ranch Doritos next to her elbow, half empty. "Water's still rising," I said. She looked up. "How much?" "Steady, nothing new." It was mostly true. She nodded and went back to her folder. She was doing that thing people do when they're terrified and trying not to show it. Very focused on ordinary tasks, very interested in county forms she'd already read twice. I understood it. I just didn't have any paperwork left to pretend to care. I needed something to do with my hands and my brain. "I'm going to look for a secondary exit," I told her. "Roof hatch, loading access, anything upper level." She just said, "Okay," didn't ask why. I think she was glad to have a reason to believe someone had a plan. The records room was 2 doors down from the break room, on the north end of the upper floor. I'd clocked it on the way in. Metal shelving units, filing cabinets, the kind of room that exists in every industrial building and nobody ever touches. The door was unlocked. I pushed it open, hitting the light switch out of habit. Nothing happened, obviously. I unclipped my flashlight. The room smelled like wet cardboard and something older underneath that. The shelving on the left wall had partially collapsed. One unit tipped forward and leaning against the next one like a domino that hadn't finished falling. Papers were everywhere. A lot of them were water damaged from some previous event, edges brown and warped, stuck together. I moved along the walls, checking for hatches, checking the ceiling. There was a vent panel near the north wall, but it was too small for a person. No loading door, no hatch. I turned back to the collapsed shelving and started moving pieces of it because I needed to see the wall behind it. It was slow going. The metal unit was heavy, and the papers underneath it were matted into a kind of wet pulp that made the concrete floor slippery. I heaved the first section aside and found the wall behind it, which was just brick, no hatch. I moved the second section and found more wall and also a cardboard box that had been crushed flat. On top of the crushed box sat a 3-ring binder in a yellow plastic cover. I almost left it there. I picked it up mainly because it was in my way, and I looked at the cover because that's just what you do. The typed label on the spine read, "OSHA Incident, Mather Mill, 2004. I stood there with my flashlight on it for a second. Then I took it to the window where the ambient light was better and opened it. The official section was standard. I've read hundreds of these. Incident date, site description, personnel involved, findings. The format doesn't change much across decades. 3 workers, one night in November, flash flood event along the Little Kanawha. Names listed: Robert Kane, Dennis Fulk, Terry Moss. Status: presumed drowned. The official narrative was about 4 paragraphs. It said, essentially, that the flood conditions had been severe, that the workers had been on the lower level when the water rose, and that recovery efforts had been unsuccessful. Case closed. Signed off by 2 county inspectors and a state safety officer. That was the official section. Behind it, someone had added pages. They were handwritten on lined notebook paper, 3-hole punched and inserted into the binder rings. The handwriting was blocky and uneven, the kind of writing that belongs to someone who doesn't hold a pen often. Capital letters in the wrong places, no commas anywhere. The ink was blue ballpoint and had bled a little in the upper margins where water had touched the paper at some point. At the bottom of the first added page, a name, Maurice Alexander, site foreman. I read it standing at the window with the swollen river rushing below me and the flashlight humming in my left hand. Maurice Alexander had written that the three workers were not on the lower level when the water rose. He'd written that they'd been in the upper room, all three of them, waiting for the flood to pass, the same as anyone would do. He'd written that the water hadn't reached them. And then he'd written, and this is the part I read twice, that he didn't know what came up from below, but it was not the water. That was it. That was the whole addendum. 6 sentences, maybe 7. No elaboration, no description of what he'd seen or heard, just the plain statement that whatever took those 3 men out of the upper room of Mather Mill in November of 2004, it was not the flood. I stayed at the window for a minute. The river was loud from here, making that low, constant sound it makes when it's moving fast and carrying heavy things. I flipped back through the binder, looking for anything I'd missed. There was a reference near the back, a handwritten note in the same blocky writing. Just a page number and a year, 1994 report cross-file. I walked back to the collapsed shelving and shined my light over the pulpy mess of papers on the floor. Most of them were garbage, maintenance logs, equipment invoices, a stack of time cards from the 90s that had fused into a solid brick. But there was a second binder pinned under the far edge of the shelving unit, thinner than the first, green cover, no label. I yanked it out. It was a 1994 incident report. Different owner, different company name on the header, something called Alderman Textile Holdings. Different inspectors, different everything except 2 things. 2 missing workers. November flood event, Little Kanawha, presumed drowned. I flipped to the back. Behind the official pages was the same lined notebook paper, the same blocky handwriting, the same blue ballpoint ink. Maurice Alexander, site foreman. I read the addendum, then I read it again because I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me in the dark. I hadn't made a mistake. It was word for word the same as the 2004 notes. Not similar, not the same general idea with different phrasing. The exact same sentences in the exact same order with the exact same capital letters in the wrong places and the exact same missing commas. Like he'd memorized what he'd written the first time and just wrote it again 10 years later because nothing new had happened that needed saying. He had been at this building twice across a decade, and he had survived both times. I turned the page. There was a final section titled simply Survival Notes. He wrote that he'd been on the roof both times, that he'd been shouting, that he'd been trying to get visual contact with the road crew he knew was coming. He wrote that he'd kept moving because standing still on a roof in a flood event was how you got hypothermia. So he'd paced and stomped and made noise and waved his arms like an idiot. Then came the last line. I do not know why I am here and they are not. I have thought about it. I think it is because I did not stop. I read that 3 times. Then I went back through both incident reports slower, and I looked at every worker's last documented position. Lower level, stairwell. Upper room, stationary. Upper level, sheltering in place. Upper level, sheltering in place. Maurice Alexander, roof, moving, shouting, alive. Every single person who had gone still and waited had gone missing, every single one. And the one man who had survived across both events, a decade apart, in the exact same building, had not stopped moving. I closed the binders and held them against my chest. I stood in the records room in the dark, with the rain coming down outside and the river raging below the window. 2 doors down, Judith was sitting in a plastic chair, still, quiet, waiting, exactly where I had told her to stay. And then, from the lower level, a sound started. The sound started then. Not loud. That was the most terrifying thing about it. If I had been asleep, I might not have heard it at all. But I wasn't asleep. I was standing perfectly still in a freezing, dark records room, listening to a building I didn't know. After a while on the job, you learn the sounds a settling structure makes, the ticks and pops, the way metal contracts, the way water moves through pipes in a particular rhythm. This wasn't that. It was coming from the lower level, a slow, deliberate sound, like something heavy dragging itself through standing water. But it wasn't frantic. It wasn't debris catching on a corner and releasing in the current. It moved in a pattern. Drag, pause, drag, pause. The intervals were perfectly even. Whatever it wasn't being carried by the flood. It was moving under its own power. My stomach dropped, leaving a cold, hollow space behind. That was the moment the whole picture snapped into focus. I'd spent the last few hours being so goddamn helpful. I had been calm, methodical, and practical. Flood event. Limited signal. Here is the safest room. Sit down, stay put, and wait for rescue. I had walked Judith into a quiet room, sat her in a plastic chair, and told her not to move. I am not usually the guy who misses things. That is the entire point of my profession. You look at a structure, and you see what's wrong before it becomes a catastrophe. I had looked at everything today. The water, the exits, the foundation, except the pattern I was standing inside of. I had been doing the creature's job for it. I didn't let myself freeze. There wasn't time. I grabbed the binders, tucked them under my arm, and walked back to the break room. Judith was exactly where I had left her, sitting on the edge of the folding table, arms crossed tightly over her blazer, staring at the open door. I could tell she'd been listening to the sounds, too. Her face had taken on that specific kind of stillness people get when they are trying very hard not to show that their mind is breaking. "What is down there?" she whispered. It wasn't really a question. "I don't know exactly," I said, keeping my voice as flat and practical as I could manage. "But I know what it does, and I know how to make it leave." She looked at the binders under my arm. "Is that from the records room?" "Yeah." I set them face down on the table. "Previous incidents, same building, same conditions. There's a pattern." I looked her dead in the eye. I needed her to understand this immediately without giving her time to panic. "It takes people who stay still," I said. "Every single person who went missing in this building during a flood, they were stationary, sheltering in place, waiting quietly." Judith didn't say anything for a second. Her eyes flicked toward the dark hallway, where the rhythmic drag, pause, drag was echoing faintly up the stairwell. "And the people who didn't go missing?" she asked, her voice trembling. "One guy. He kept moving, kept making noise. Both times, a decade apart, he walked out." She swallowed hard. "Both times?" "Yeah. So we need to move. You need to move." I stepped closer, pointing toward the end of the hall. "Get to the east window, the one with the cell signal. Keep moving around the room. Do not stay in one spot. Make noise, talk, shout, bang on the glass, call out toward the lot in case the crew gets here early." I paused, gripping the heavy metal flashlight in my hand. "I need you to do that while I go deal with the other part." "What other part?" "The boiler room," I said. "There's something I need to check down there. I won't be gone long." She reached out and grabbed my arm. Not hard, just enough to anchor herself to another human being. "Sawyer, keep moving," I commanded, firmer this time. "That's the whole thing, Judith. Do not stop." She let go. I could see the gears turning in her head, whether to argue, whether to ask more questions, whether to beg me not to leave her alone. She was smart enough to know I wasn't telling her everything, but she was also terrified enough that a clear instruction felt better than the paralyzing unknown. She slid off the table, her flats hitting the linoleum. She walked toward the east window, and as she went, I heard her start talking. Just a low, steady stream of words, narrating her steps, filling the dead air. I turned and went back into the corridor. The sounds from the lower level had shifted. They were moving toward the base of the stairs now. Still patient, not rushing. I stood at the top of the stairwell, shining my beam down into the black water. Then I descended. The water hit my knees at the bottom step. It was agonizingly cold, darker than before, and the smell of river mud and old rust was suffocating. I moved fast. I kept my steps deliberate, lifting my knees high to push through the resistance, but I didn't slow down, and I definitely didn't stop. The corridor was about 40 feet long. I kept the flashlight aimed straight ahead at the boiler room door. I refused to look at the murky corners or the boarded-up windows. I just watched the iron pipe that was still wedged through the door handle. When I reached it, I stopped and looked at the angle of the brace. On my way in, I'd logged it as a contractor safety measure, locking people out. But looking at it now, the logic was backwards. If you're securing a door from the outside to keep people from wandering in, you wedge the pipe on the corridor side. You slide it through the handle, and the pipe sits between you and the door. This pipe was on the inside of the handle, angled toward the heavy steel frame. Someone had reached through from the corridor side and wedged it in a way that would hold the door closed from within. You would have to thread it through deliberately at an awkward angle, specifically to keep whatever was in that boiler room from pushing its way out. My breath hitched in my throat. I didn't think about it anymore. I grabbed the rusted iron pipe, braced my boots against the flooded floor, and yanked it free. The door swung open about 4 inches and stopped, pitch black on the other side. The sound of shifting water echoed from within. I shoved it the rest of the way open with my shoulder and swept my flashlight around. Corroded pipes, a pressure gauge reading 0, and a utility corridor leading to a concrete alcove. At the back of the alcove was the main water valve, a massive iron shutoff wheel, painted red, flaking with rust. The burst pipe I had seen earlier was somewhere in the system below this room. I could hear it, a constant pressurized bleed. The water in here was at the same level as the corridor, but it felt heavier. I waded to the back of the alcove. The wheel was a standard gate valve. You turn it clockwise to close it, righty-tighty. I grabbed the spokes with both hands, planted my feet in the muck, and hauled it counterclockwise. It was stiff. Decades of rust fought back. I put my entire body weight into it, grunting as the metal groaned. It moved a quarter turn, then another. Deep inside the walls, the pressure sound changed. It didn't get quieter, it got a hell of a lot louder, like I had ripped the throat out of the plumbing line. Water started violently rushing somewhere beneath the floorboards. I kept turning until the wheel spun freely. The sound peaked into a deafening mechanical roar, a chaotic rush of pressurized water echoing through the concrete chamber. It was the loudest thing in the building. It was a massive, vibrating beacon. Come get me, I thought. I didn't wait around to see if it worked. I backed out of the alcove, waded out of the boiler room, and pulled the heavy steel door shut behind me. Then I turned toward the stairs and moved as fast as the black water would let me. I took the stairs 2 at a time, the water sloughing off my heavy boots. When I pushed through the stairwell door onto the upper floor, the sound of the ruptured water main below was a dull, vibrating roar through the concrete. It was doing exactly what I needed it to do, screaming into the dark. Judith was at the east window. She had found an old coffee can somewhere, the massive industrial metal kind you see in break rooms, and she was rhythmically slamming it against the stone window frame. Clang, clang, clang. She was also talking. It wasn't a conversation. It was a continuous, frantic stream of consciousness directed out at the flooded lot below, like she was narrating the disaster to an empty audience. The water's up past the barrier now. It's covering the gravel. The rain is still coming down, but the wind is shifting. When she heard the stairwell door close behind me, she spun around, the coffee can raised like a weapon. "Still here," she said, her chest heaving. "Good." I walked to the far end of the room and sat down on an old wooden shipping crate, positioning myself where I had a clear line of sight to both the stairwell door and the east window. "Keep going," I told her. She turned back to the glass. Clang, clang, clang. And the gray truck is still stuck, but it hasn't floated away. I sat there in the gloom and listened. Below us, fighting beneath the roar of the opened water valve, was the other sound. The rhythmic patience of it. The slow, deliberate drag, pause, drag I'd been hearing for the last hour. I listened to it, and I listened to Judith battering the metal can against the stone, and I waited to see which one changed first. It took maybe 15 minutes. The patience went out of the sounds below. That's the only way I can describe it. They had been so even, so entirely unhurried, moving with the terrifying confidence of a predator that knows its prey is trapped. But then something shifted. The rhythm broke. The interval between the heavy, dragging splashes shortened. It sounded faster, less regular, frantic almost, like something that had been absolutely certain of its meal was suddenly very confused by the chaotic noise of the water main and the banging from above. I sat perfectly still on the crate, my hand white-knuckling my flashlight, and watched the stairwell door. I didn't breathe. The dragging sound sped up, moving away from the base of the stairs, back toward the boiler room, back toward the flooded depths of the lower level. Then they stopped completely. A second later, I felt a displacement shudder through the floorboards. A long, low, rushing sound echoed up from below, like a massive volume of water being displaced all at once by something large moving through it very fast. One direction. Away. Then nothing. Just the steady bleed of the water valve and the rain against the roof. Judith stopped banging the can. She looked back at me, her arm trembling. "Was that—" "Keep going," I snapped. "But not yet. Keep going." She hit the stone again, her voice wavering now. "It's getting lighter out, maybe just a little bit." I sat there for another 20 minutes by my watch. I didn't hear anything from the lower level except the mechanical rush of water. Finally, I stood up, walked to the stairwell, and pointed my flashlight down. The water was higher now. It had crept 6 inches up the bottom step, black and undisturbed. There was no movement, no pale, elongated shape lurking near the exterior wall through the window at the base of the stairs. I stood there for a full minute, watching the surface. Nothing broke it. I went back into the room. Judith was sitting on the floor near the east window, her back against the wall, the dented coffee can resting in her lap. She looked up when I walked in. "It's gone," I said. I kept my voice flat. "Water's still rising on the lower level, but the thing is gone. Moved back toward the river, I think." She let out a breath. It wasn't dramatic, just a long, shuddering exhale, like all the air leaving a punctured tire. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." She stood up, though her legs were noticeably shaky. She grabbed the windowsill for a second to steady herself, then let go. "We need to move before the ground floor gets any worse," I told her. "The water was at 6 inches on the bottom step 20 minutes ago, and it's not going to stop. The little Kanawha is still running high. We have a window right now, and we need to use it." She was already pulling her blazer straight, looking around for her bag. She'd set it on the break room table at some point. She hurried down the hall and came back out with it slung over her shoulder. Somehow she looked more put together than she had any right to look after the morning we'd had. I probably looked like I'd been dragged backward through a muddy culvert. "My car is parked up on the access road," she said, her voice finding its professional cadence again. "Higher ground. I can drive around to the front lot barrier and pick you up." "Wait for me," I said, shining my light toward the hall. "We'll go out together. It's fine." "Sawyer, my car is right there." She gestured at my soaked, mud-caked cargo pants and heavy boots. "I'll be faster without wading through whatever that is down there. I can get the engine running. I'll have the heat on for you." She was already backing toward the stairwell door. "Judith," I started, stepping forward, but she was already through it. The heavy fire door swung shut behind her with a metallic click. I stood there for maybe 2 seconds, listening to her footsteps hurry down the metal grate of the stairs. I told myself she'd be fine. The access road was elevated. Her car was dry. She was moving. I had drilled it into her head. Keep making noise. Keep moving. The creature had retreated to the river. She would be fine. I told myself that. And then I unclipped my flashlight, gripped it tight, and followed her down into the dark. The water on the ground floor was at my knees now. It was freezing, pitch black, and it smelled intensely of river mud, old rust, and something else, something rotten that I refused to think about. I moved slowly, because moving fast through water that deep over unseen debris is how you fall, and I was absolutely not going to fall in that building. I kept my flashlight raised, my eyes locked on the front exit 40 feet away, and I didn't look at the dark corners. I just walked it, steady and deliberate. I hit the steps, pushed the heavy steel door, and stepped outside. The rain had finally dropped to a thin drizzle. The sky was starting to transition from absolute black to that dark, bruised gray that happens just before dawn. Not light, exactly, just less dark. The lot was still a lake of moving water, though it seemed to have leveled off. My gray Chevy was still wedged against the concrete barrier where the surge had pushed it, sitting at a sickening angle, with water swirling around the tires. I didn't look at it for long. I looked up the hill, toward the elevated access road. Judith's car was there, the white Honda Civic, parked on the gravel shoulder where the elevation had kept it completely dry. The engine was running. I could see the pale exhaust pluming in the cold air. The headlights were cutting twin beams through the morning mist, and the driver's door was standing wide open. I froze. For a second, I told myself a very logical story. I figured she had just gotten out to look for me. Maybe she couldn't see me in the dark lot. Maybe she had walked to the edge of the embankment to call down. I started up the hill. The mud was soft, and I slipped once, catching myself on a rotting fence post that was barely still upright. I reached the access road and walked toward the idling car. It was empty. The heater was blasting. Her county ID badge was resting on the dash. "Judith?" I called out. Not a shout, just her name. No answer. Only the hum of the engine and the distant roar of the river. I looked at the ground. The mud on the shoulder was soft enough to hold prints. Her flats, small, narrow shoes, were clearly pressed into the dirt, but they weren't pointed toward the building, and they were pointed down the access road toward town. They were pointed away from the road, down the opposite side of the embankment, toward the river. I don't know what I was thinking. I think I was desperately hoping there was a rational explanation. Maybe she thought she heard someone. Maybe she dropped something. I followed the prints. They led down the far side of the embankment, through wet grass that had been beaten flat by the storm, pushing through a stand of thorny scrub brush that tore at my wet cargo pants. The ground sloped steeply downward, and the sound of the little Kanawha got louder with every step. The bank was maybe 30 feet of slick mud and dead vegetation between the brush line and the water. The river was a violent black churn, running way above its normal line, carrying massive branches and plastic debris that I didn't want to look at too closely. The sound of it was deafening. I followed the footprints to the very edge of the bank. They stopped. Just stopped at the waterline. The mud there was churned deeply, both feet dug in, like she had been standing there, like she had been planted there. And then, nothing. No prints going back up the hill. No prints moving laterally along the bank. No sign she had gone anywhere except directly into the raging water. I stood there, letting the river rush past me. I didn't call her name again. I already knew. I think I knew when I saw the car door open. I think I knew the second she walked out of that stairwell ahead of me. "Keep moving," I had told her. "Make noise." And she had. She had banged that metal can. She had talked to the empty lot, and she had survived the dark of Mather Mill. She had walked right out the front door. But then she reached the car. She started the engine. She turned on the heater. She sat down in the driver's seat. And she waited. "I'll have the heat on for you," she had said. She had stopped moving. She had become stationary. The creature hadn't retreated into the deep water to hide from my noise in the boiler room. It had slipped out into the floodwaters, bypassed the building entirely, and gone looking for the quietest, stillest thing it could find. I had figured out the rules, and I had survived because of them. But I had let her go to the car alone, knowing she was going to sit there and wait for me. I sat down on the muddy embankment just above the waterline in the freezing wet grass. I pulled my hands into my jacket. My fingers brushed against something cold metal in my pocket. Her key ring. I didn't even remember grabbing it from the ignition. It was just an automatic habit. 3 keys and a blue plastic tag from the Tyler County Assessor's Office, her name printed in small white letters. I waited for the emergency crew. They arrived just after dawn, pulling up in a county emergency truck and a white SUV. I didn't stand up. I just watched them come down the embankment toward me, their flashlights cutting through the gray morning light. A guy in a county uniform reached me first. His name tag read Clark. He had sharp blue eyes and looked like he hadn't slept, but he was holding it together. He crouched down next to me. "You the inspector?" he asked. "Yeah." "Where's the assessor, the woman?" I pointed toward the churning black water. She went to the river, I said. My voice sounded completely dead. I told him where the footprints ended. He looked at me for a long second, then stood up and barked orders to the rest of the crew. They spent the next 40 minutes working the bank downstream, their voices echoing over the water, calling out her name. Judith. Judith Sanchez. Hearing her name in other people's mouths made me want to throw up. The little Kanawha just kept running, indifferent and heavy. Whatever it had taken, it had already carried a long way from here. When Clark finally came back, he sat near me with a waterproof notepad. He asked me to walk him through it. I told him the truth. The flood alert, the car shifting, the retreat to the upper floor. I told him the water had started receding and Judith had gone ahead to start her car while I was finishing up inside. I told him I followed her out, found the door open, and tracked the footprints to the bank. Every word of it was technically true. I'm not sure that matters, but it's what happened. He wrote it all down. He didn't push on the gaps. He was thorough in the way people are thorough when they've already formed the narrative and just need to fill out the paperwork. Flash flood event. One victim swept into the river. Before I left, I handed him the binders. I told him what they were. The 2004 report, the 1994 report, Maurice Alexander's handwritten notes in the margins. I told him there was a pattern and that the official findings were wrong. Clark flipped through them. He looked at the blocky handwriting, then looked at me. You want me to include this in the report? I want it on record, I said. What you do with it is your call. He tucked the binders under his arm, told me they'd need me for follow-up questions later in the week, and let me go. I got my truck started on the third try, cranked the heat, and drove away from Mather Mill. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. The property sale fell through that Friday. The buyer walked. The firm sent an email saying they were sorry for the inconvenience and hoped the flood situation hadn't been too disruptive. I went back to work the following week, a commercial building conversion in Fairmont. I drove out there with my clipboard and my camera, and I did the job. I wrote the report. I filed it. I'm good at the work. You go in, you look at what's there, you document it accurately, and you move on to the next one. Clark called me 10 days later to officially close the case. Presumed drowning. The family had been notified. He asked if I had thought of anything else. I told him no. I had thought of plenty of things, but none of them were things I was ever going to say to Gavin Clark or anyone else. Maurice Alexander had written the truth twice, left it in a dark room, and lived his life knowing nobody would ever believe him. I understand him now. Judith Sanchez's keys are still in the top drawer of my desk. I don't know why I kept them. Just a ring with 3 keys and a blue plastic tag. I'm alive. I didn't stop moving, and I'm alive. That's the whole story.